Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to invite you on a treasure hunt because I found a chest. It was in a cave on a desert island, protected from the elements for centuries. And inside of this chest, some of the true treasures of human thought and culture, books that were thought lost to time. We thought that they were gone, the last copies burned or disintegrated as papyri, the clay tablets shattered. Maybe they had disappeared when the library at Alexandria was destroyed. Perhaps it was the House of Wisdom in Baghdad when Baghdad was sacked and that was gone. The 15th century when numerous codices were burned here in the American continents. But we found this chest, so it's time to open it up because I've always been fascinated by this idea. The idea that there were texts that we knew had been written, that existed in some form, that people had been able to read or listen to or see performed and to appreciate, that had influenced our thought and culture in numerous different cultures all over the world. And so this was an idea that I thought was really fascinating. I remember encountering it in the little bios when we would read plays by Sophocles in secondary school. There would be this mention that, oh, Oedipus or Antigone, which was what would be commonly read, is one of the few surviving plays from Sophocles. We know he wrote some 100, but there are only 7 or so left. And I thought, what happened to the other 100? That's astonishing. That's horrifying. And then later on, as I delved deeper into reading, I remember reading The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. And in that, there was this whole idea around texts that perhaps were in the library here in this book that had been considered lost, famously one from Aristotle that I will not find in this chest, sadly. But I remember that really just continued to feed this idea. It was something that continued to build. And then coupling that with the discovery in the 20th century of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls in a cave, the idea that texts that had been thought lost for millennia suddenly were found. Texts that no one knew had been written, some of the scrolls that were there, such as the War Scroll, and others that were copies of works that had been transmitted orally or through some other written transmission to be able to be compared. And so I thought, well, listen, if I was going to find a chest in a cave, and there was some works in there, what would be in that chest? So I've got a little list here, and I hope you'll indulge me. Perhaps you can share some of your own in the comments. But the first group I'm going to put in are works that we know existed on some level, and that quite possibly maybe are out there in some cave. They might be there. They might actually be somewhere for someone to find. So first off, I do want to share Sophocles. Sophocles is a brilliant tragedian. I think there are ways in which Oedipus Tyrannus, probably like the single best Greek tragedy, and probably one of the finest tragedies ever written in any culture. It's an incredible play. Antigone, Oedipus at Colonus each reveal different facets. I'm also a huge fan of The Women of Trachis, the Trachiniae. I think that's an amazing play. So, as I said, we only have about roughly maybe less than 10% of Sophocles' plays. For comparison, imagine if all we had from Shakespeare was his best play, Hamlet, just as we have Oedipus from Sophocles, but we had Hamlet, Taming of the Shrew, Henry IV Part 2, and then pick one other play, maybe Antony and Cleopatra, maybe Twelfth Night. If that's all we had from Shakespeare, how would we view him? Particularly in comparison to, say, still having 4 plays from John Ford or John Webster, 2 plays from Christopher Marlowe. How would we actually view Shakespeare if all we had were Taming the Shrew, Henry IV Part 1, Twelfth Night, and Hamlet? We would still find much to appreciate there, but I don't know how we would regard his intellect. And Sophocles was very much like the Shakespeare of the Athenian stage. So if I could pick one play that we know Sophocles wrote, I would pick Niobe. And here's the reason for that. We have a sense from some other fragments that Aeschylus had written a version of Niobe where the play started with Niobe just silently grieving on the stage as the chorus was performing and as sort of the action was occurring across the first half of the play. And then Niobe would sort of have this entrance where she starts speaking, analogous to perhaps what Clytemnestra does in Aeschylus's Agamemnon. The way that on its own would sound incredible, but Sophocles had such a depth of emotion and plotting, the way he could be so intricate. And he was also very adept at having characters deal with grief and think through grief on some level. The way that Oedipus realizes what is happening as the tragedy progresses is something that could have been really like powerful and truly horrifying. as Niobe realizes, what has happened to her children when Apollo and Artemis begin to just slaughter them, and how Sophocles could perhaps give voice to that in fascinating and interesting way. I think that's the one play I would want. There would be 100. It would be amazing to find any of them, but that would be the one I would want to find in this treasure chest that I just opened up. Second, I've got some actual scrolls, not just the tiny little fragments. I'll as an example, I'll read a fragment. We have tiny fragments from the Greek lyric poets, and there are numerous ones. In the great tradition of Orpheus, perhaps, and perhaps the most famous is Sappho. Anacreon is another who's quite famous. He has the one that is almost aphorism, where it's like, he who has a mind to fight, let him fight, that type of thing. But if you can imagine, if we could find like whole sheets of poetry from these. Imagine if all we had from some of our most famous poets were 2 or 3 complete poems, and then a scattering of lines. Or in other cases, such as Alcaeus or Anacreon, if all we had were perhaps 3 lines at most in any given poem, and then there are 2 fragments with only 5 lines. That gives a sense of what we're missing when we talk about the Greek lyric poets. So I'm finding them in my chest as well. A couple of scrolls of great poetry. Finally, my boy Livy. I think a lot of people who are fans of classical history, of Roman history in particular, love Livy. There's a sense that he's writing a prose epic, that he's taking the way that we've thought about epic and the way that people have thought about grand plots, and he puts these long and eloquent speeches in characters, historical personages' mouths. And what we have from Livy is incredible. We have the sort of mythical founding of Rome, the early kings. We have the early conflicts in Rome with other Italian nations and tribes. We have then the incredible volumes on the Second Punic War with Hannibal, and the way that Hannibal and Scipio are really built up as these two, personages who are going to be brought into massive conflict. And that detail that Livy creates here. If I could have one more from Livy, I want to know a little bit more about Pyrrhus of Epirus, in part because when Pyrrhus he's this bridge almost from Alexander to Rome, because Pyrrhus had fought in the wars of the Diadochi with Alexander's successors and generals. He famously survived the Battle of 6 Kings and would later march, fight the Roman Republic. That, I think, would be incredible to see how Livy would characterize Pyrrhus. I'm less interested in what Livy would have to say about, Drusus and Tiberius and Augustus and the Roman civil wars. We have so many texts on that, and they're all self-serving. We wouldn't need Livy doing some version of propaganda on that as well. I would love to know how Livy would characterize Pyrrhus, though. Those would be the books from Ab Urbe Condita that I would want to find. So those are works that we know existed. They were written down somewhere at some point, and they've just disappeared, sadly. The next version is going to be a little tougher, because these are going to be works that all have something in common. Something like fire. And usually fire and the author, intentional or unintentional. So the first one we're going to talk about is Thomas de Quincey. And I did a video on Suspiria de Profundis 3.5 years ago. Suspiria de Profundis there's some very interesting elements in that. It's had a huge cultural footprint, casts a very long shadow. I actually think the shadow of Suspiria de Profundis in the 20th century is even longer and more full than the shadow that he cast with Confessions of an English Opium Eater. But missing more than half potentially, of Suspiria de Profundis, in part because De Quincey was much older as he was writing those sections. So we have titles for them, and perhaps he didn't finish all of them, but De Quincey did have a problem where he would light things on fire as he was working at night. And sometimes it was the paper, sometimes it was his elbow or his clothing, which is sad and frightening that was sort of where he was at in terms of his ability to write and work at night. But almost certainly sections of Suspiria de Profundis were written by De Quincey, or partially written and then burned. And he perhaps didn't even realize they were being burned in the moment. But I would love to know, what we have from Suspiria is fascinating. It would be incredible to have more. Second one is one where the author sort of did intentionally burn them and knew what was happening, and people have lamented this in the intervening century and a half since it happened. But loads of folks love Nikolai Gogol. They love his stories. Dead Souls is fantastic. The Dead Souls was supposed to have sort of 3 books. In many ways, it was supposed to sort of imitate the comedy of Dante. And so we were supposed to see, you know, characters who seem very venal and greedy and satiric, but are gradually going to change and develop and have this dynamic life to them. Unfortunately, Gogol did burn whole sections that he had written in the aftermath of publishing the first part of Dead Souls, and I would love to have known what was in those papers that went into the fire. Again, these are two sections where almost certainly those don't exist, but if somehow a copy turned up, I'd love to read them. Finally, one where we don't know how much was burned. Maybe it was exaggerated, but it certainly seems to have derailed and sort of shattered the confidence of a great writer, and that is Ralph Ellison with Juneteenth, or 3 Days Before the Shooting. I read Juneteenth this year. I loved it. I read whole sections from 3 Days Before the Shooting, which collects sort of all of the writings Ellison had done in trying to finish his second work. In 1967, some 15 years or so after he had published Invisible Man, there was a big fire at his house, the house he was staying at, and he claimed at the time that much of the manuscript for the second novel that he'd been working on for over a decade had burned. And he famously would go and ask people, like, do you remember? Like, he had done readings to various friends, and so he, like, Saul Bellow and others. So he would go to them and say, what do you remember? What do you remember? I need to rewrite it. Later, there were claims that perhaps not too much actually burned, but whatever burned, it seems to have really just shattered Ellison's confidence to the point where it became almost a Sisyphean task for him to try and finish the work. He kept expanding and expanding and expanding. And perhaps if he'd been able to finish a second novel that was even the first part of a projected trilogy, that would have allowed him to start then finishing the middle part of that projected trilogy and such. And I think with what I've found in Juneteenth and how much I just could appreciate in there, I think it would have been incredible for Ralph Ellison to see how others could appreciate his work in his lifetime. So that would be one. Again, we don't know how much was gone, but I think it had an effect. Now, this next group is something that is sort of in a category of its own, because these are works that were burned. But this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't something like Gogol, where, you know, in a serious moment, in a moment of crisis, he burned his own work. And that would be the enormous loss of Aztec and Mayan codices in the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, the Mayan codices, some of those we have some transcriptions from that were done by Spanish priests who had come into Central America or southern Mexico now. And there's a couple of issues. We don't know how qualified, how strong how accurate, I should say, the translations were. And it was just wanton destruction. Reams of books were just burned as heretical, as impinging on the ability of the priests and missionaries to convert Native Americans. And there is an entire tragedy of human life that was occurring. There was also a cultural destruction that occurred as well. In the 15th century, a lot of the Aztec codices were burned by Aztecs as they tried to centralize one stream of historical thought. Now, we have some texts. We have Lord Eight Deer, which is basically a pictographic text, and it's really, really incredible to sit and page through that and see what it looks like. But imagining what was lost there is it would be incredible just to have 3 more of those. I didn't include the inking quipus. Famously, they're the strands of cords with knots in them that could be used to give numbers or accountings, because we have several hundred of those. There were plenty that were destroyed in the 16th century by Pizarro and his crew in South America, but we do have several hundred of those. I think that I group more with Linear A, where we have examples of it, we just can't interpret it at all. But if we had the Mayan or Aztec codices, that would be an incredible treasure trove. Now, moving from there into what I'll call my top 2, the 2 that I would be overjoyed if we found another 50 pages from either of these two texts, because we have some, and what we have is fantastic. It's absolutely incredible. It's unprecedented in some ways. It's just so special to actually read what's left of these texts. If we could imagine, though, what there was beyond that. And we know that there were these huge, enormous books that were published thousands of years ago that were just absolute dynamite. It's probably some of the greatest works ever written. Now, one of these I learned about, wow, at this point, it's almost 20 years ago. I think it's 19 years ago. Through this book, Prometheans, Ancient and Modern by Burton Rascoe. This looks like a book that's about to be needing a desert cave to be rescued. But I read a copy in college, and it included various writers I'd never heard of, and I wanted to read all the works by these writers. And the one I was most excited to read was the Satyricon by Petronius. It's from the 1st century of the Common Era. We have 150 pages, about 150 pages. This book was probably over 1,000 pages long. So imagine if all we had from Ulysses was a chapter and a half or 2 chapters from Joyce's Ulysses. Or imagine if we had In Search of Lost Time, but all we had was the second half of the second volume In the Shadow of Young Girls and Flower, and the first half of The Gramontis Way, or the second half of The Gramontis Way and the first half of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's all we have. Now, just from those texts, we would know that Joyce was onto something special. We would know that Proust was a fantastic writer who had this subtle characterization, this incredible focus on sexual jealousy. We'd be amazed by what they had produced in those pages. But if we were then told, hey, there was a lot more, you're missing out. You can imagine like how we would feel lost. Pick your favorite writer, and now imagine you have only a third of one of their books. That's what we have with Petronius. We have fragments. We have self-contained episodes that allow us to see what he was capable of. This book is bonkers. It's incredible. It goes in so many different directions. It's a satire. It's filled with realistic detail. It's exaggerated with hyperbole. And what he's accomplishing here is just unprecedented on some level. And to know that this is maybe a tenth of what he had actually written, perhaps even less, is shattering. So this would always be one of mine. I hope we find more of that one day. The other is a book that I think a lot of folks haven't heard of, perhaps on BookTube or readers who are more familiar with works from Europe or North America, and that is the Brihatkathā, the long story or the long narrative by Gunadhya. Now, this is a work that was originally the works we have from it, the recensions from it, are in Sanskrit. From the middle of the first millennium in the Common Era, so 4th to 6th century, there might be some recensions from it. There's one, I don't want to butcher the names. The Vasudevahindi from Sangharasa seems to be probably the oldest recension we have. We do have the full verse abridgment of the Brihatkathā, The Emperor of the Sorcerers by Budhasvamin, which is amazing. I'll be doing a video on this in the near future. This is an amazing work. We also have sort of a frame narrative for what happened to how Gunadhya's Brihatkathā was written and transmitted in Somadeva's Kathāsaritsāgara, The Ocean of the Rivers of Story. And even this is kind of in a bind because there hasn't been an English translation of the Kathāsaritsāgara in over 100 years, and the ones that the full translations we have are very sanitized and I don't want to quite say juvenilized, but they remove quite a bit that would have seemed offensive to readers of the time in Victorian England. But of course, we do have the full Sanskrit text of the Kathāsaritsāgara. But what we have from these works from the Vasudevahindi are different aspects of Gunadhya's great long story, which potentially was tens of thousands of pages long, potentially 30,000 pages long as a text. And we have, about 400 pages here. The Kathāsaritsāgara is quite a bit longer. We have maybe 600, 700, 800 pages there. The Vasudevahindi, again, perhaps 200 to 300 pages. So we have these sections from it that give, in some ways, different versions of the text. But it's just an incredible work. what we see are individuals across so many different walks of life in India at that time, and across India, mostly in perhaps northern India, what is now modern Nepal as well, but going farther south, all the way down to the southern portion of the Indian subcontinent, over on the western side. It really is just a tour de force of what is revealed there. The metaphors, the imagery is just fascinating. And what we have, as I said, from Budhasvamin, from Somadeva, is just fantastic. To know that there is potentially 30 times that length is just mind-boggling. Even the verse abridgment, the Emperor of the Sorcerers, we have a portion of that. We have maybe a fourth of what that could have been. But if I could pick one, I would want the whole thing, the whole Gunadhya. And famously, there's a really incredible, in the Kathāsaritsāgara, there's a really incredible story of how this was composed, that Gunadhya had made a grammar error at some point and was sort of caught out in it. And so he had renounced using the major, languages and dialects of his time and land. And so all he was able to work with was referred to as the language of the goblins. Basically meant this like almost coarse, brutish language that's translated as Peshachi. And that's what he had. And so he went to read it, and they said, hey, that's not a language that we read, great works. And what are you talking about? And so he stood there and he was burning sections of it. And as he was burning it, he was reading from it. And all of the animals were listening, were gathered around listening. And so nothing could be found. Nobody could hunt anything or find any food. And that's how they finally come and find this great story that then came down. So that would be my number one. That's the one that in the past year and a half has managed to supplant Petronius, who, as I mentioned, I spent almost 20 years hoping every year that someone's going to, stumble into a cave and find a little bit more of the Satyricon. But these would be my top two. I would really be curious if other folks have works they would want to include on the list. I may or may not have voluntarily chosen to not mention the missing suitcase in the early 1920s from an American expatriate. But let me know what you'd hope to find in your treasure chest. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.